digitize the satin, we start off with this icon right here. Here's our crosshair. Digitizing a satin is a little more intense than digitizing a fill because you have to put in point and counterpoint. Point, counterpoint, point, counterpoint. Every point that you put in has to have a counterpoint across from it. The across from it part, that determines your column width. Right now on the screen, if I put in a point where my crosshair is, that column width would be 23 millimeters. Way too wide to be a satin stitch. Your machine not going to do that. It's not going to sew. Keep conscious of how wide you're getting. I don't like to be above 8. Remember that? When I'm doing a satin, I never want it to be wider than 8 or narrower than 1. That's my threshold. Never narrower than 1, never wider than 8. If I put in a point, I have to put the counterpoint in. The software will not let me exit that shape by putting in my point without putting in my counterpoint. All the same features we learned with a fill stitch still apply. Middle click, middle click. These are your curves. If I make a mistake, backspace. Again, point or counterpoint, point, counterpoint, point. When you're backspacing, make sure you know what where you're at. When you've got your point and your counterpoint in there, and you hit your backspace key, then you've got to take out both of them. Okay? If I want a straight line, O, O. Now, here's a fundamental difference between a satin and a fill. A satin doesn't have to be a closed shape. Think about your lettering that's satin. S, A's. Most lettering is not a closed shape. If you want it to be closed, you have to press the tab key. Right click to tell it you're done, right or left to set your exit point. Now, you don't have to worry about your stitch angle here, okay? You just want to set your exit point based on what you're going to stitch out next. What sets your what sets your stitch angle for a satin stitch are these lines. That's what determines your stitch angle. Okay? Now, so when you're putting in a satin, you don't want to cross. Okay? When you're putting in your satin, be conscious of your counterpoints. All right, not so good right there. Whereas see how much better and cleaner that satin is? That's because I paid attention to these crossbars. That represents my angle that the stitches are going to follow. You know, you never want anything that might look like this. Because watch what happens. See that pinch? Okay? That's because of the angle, that's because of the way I put in my points and my counterpoints. Now, as I'm putting in points and counterpoints, if I realize that I'm done, go ahead and right click, set your exit point, and there you go. To put a curved in on a satin stitch, what you're going to want to do is put in points, one a little closer, one a little closer. And that's going to give you your curved end on your satin. Alright, now I can do a drop shadow on this satin stitch. Select it, Tools, Add Shadow, tell it my overlap, place my shadow. It resequences it to sew first. Okay, there's my drop shadow. Now, question was a pointed end. We did a curved end. How would you do a pointed end? Well, what I do on my pointed end is I'll angle it. Okay? Some people will do this. Okay? But I like the angle method. That gives it the illusion of a pointed end, but you don't have all those short stitches that you had before built in right there. Okay? Now, I can do a drop shadow. I can add a border. Outlines, borders. Here we have three options that we can do to a satin stitch. We can put a running stitch around it. Real simple. Run around satin, stitch it out. There's our running stitch. We can make a copy of the item as a fill stitch. You want this to be a fill instead of a satin? Not a problem. Click it, outlines, borders, fill from satin. Now look, there's my satin, there's my fill. Finally, we can put a border around the satin. Outlines, borders, satin around satin, Here, you have to know how wide you want it. If you get too wide, you're going to cover up your bottom layer. All right, we're going to say 2, color number 1. Okay. Generate my stitches. Now, with the satin, I could break this thing apart. If I wanted to go in and take this satin border and split it apart, then what I can do, point, split, point, split, and there we go. Okay, so I can break that satin apart by using my split option under the point menu. Of course, I can move points, edit points, things like that, anything I want to do. Now, with the satin stitch, we give you 3 different stitch effects that are built in to a new design. We give you a basic satin. We give you a satin fill. This is for large lettering or large satins. Remember, I told you my threshold is about 8 millimeters for my column width. Well, if I'm going to put this design or any design on a towel, for a jacket back, and I know that my stitches are going to be long and pushing the limit, I'll go ahead and use Satin Fill. We give you one for small satin. Small satin, again, if you know that your lettering is going to, or your satin stitch is really, really tiny, you can go ahead and choose small satin. It's already got the stitch settings set up for a small satin effect. Finally, zigzag fix. Very infrequently used. Traditionally, it's for applique. So those are the ones that we give you right off the bat. Now, if I want to change my stitch settings on a satin, go to this icon. Don't worry about that. Pitch. 0.4 again is the default. Tighter pitch, lower the number. 0.38, 0.35. Never below 0.30. Unless you're doing puffy foam. Puffy foam, I tend to use 0.18. That is the only time I will use an effect of a pitch that is that type. Back to my wicking stuff. 0.5-ish. Okay? I have different corners. I have a mitered corner. This is turned on. This is what it looks like. Nice, good looking corner. If I've got really, really tiny lettering, I like corners turned off. The reason is because I don't want those stitches to get any smaller than they already are. Okay? Block corners, typically only used with a zigzag. See how it sews to the edge, then it sews over? If you use a block corner with a pitch of 0.4, then you're going to get a buildup or a bump right there. Okay? Short longs. You know, short longs is one of those options where, again, the only time I would turn them off is if I were working with puffy foam. Other than that, I leave them on all the time. Now, I always use comp with a fill stitch, a satin stitch. That satin stitch by nature is going to pull in on itself. If I'm doing percentage, might use about 15%. If I'm doing millimeter, I might only use 1 or 2. 3, it's not going to be able to handle as much. Okay? How much comp you use, again, goes back to, all right, what kind of fabric am I stitching on? Is it pulling? Am I having trouble with my border pulling away from my fill? Things like that. That's what will cause you to want to go in and use comp. I have 11 underlay choices for my satin. Again, defaults to zigzag, good default. You need a little bit less underlay, back it down. Double, single tacking, which is the least you can get. Need just a little bit more, give it a little more stability, use cross. Great one for that. Need to hold down that nap because you're sewing on a beanie or a towel or robe or fleece jacket. Use something over here. Okay? You've got a horse blanket that's got a real high pile. Triple zigzag. Okay? Now, you have specialty satins. Go here, load, go to your library, satin. These are all specialty satin stitches. Down here, these are my favorite. These are random. On the left, on the right, and on both sides. 13, 14, and 15. I can come in here, take my satin stitch. There's 13. There's 14. And here's 15. Now, these are random effects, okay? What that means is every time I generate my stitches, it's going to do it different. Well, let's say I come across one of these and I really like it. Oh, that's my favorite. That's the way I want it. Okay? I don't want to regenerate. Outlines, toggle active. It locks the stitches just for that area. See, I can turn off all my other stitches, but it didn't turn these off. It locked it for that area. Now you can't make this design right now. I couldn't make it bigger or smaller. Okay? If I wanted it to be bigger or smaller, I would have to come in here and unlock it, and then I could turn my stitches off and regenerate, make it bigger or smaller. But I just lost, I'll have to regenerate again until I find another one I like. All right? So that's how you use that totally random stitch effect. All right.